Hi everyone, and welcome to my 20,000 subscribers question and answer video. Sorry for the delay on this one. I've actually been filming and editing two longish videos at the same time that took priority. One of them's come out since, the Flagstaff Gardens one, and the other one will hopefully be coming out shortly. As you might be aware, this channel hit 20,000 subscribers a couple of weeks ago, which is still mind-boggling to me. And I'm really very grateful to everyone for your support and help on this pretty unexpected journey. So like last time, I've had a bunch of questions to answer, so thank you to everyone who sent them in. I'm also stealing/taking inspiration from Taitset's Q&A video of just having some random footage of mine on the screen while I talk in the background. Some of it's from overseas, some of it's from Melbourne, bits and pieces of stuff from videos that I never got to use. So a mix of that. Hopefully it's vaguely interesting while I'm talking. And I'll also use some of it to illustrate what I'm talking about at some points. And if I don't get to your questions, I'm sorry, I probably just missed it while putting them all together. So let's kick off with two questions from Shareth over at Building Beautifully, who you may remember from our collaborative video a while back comparing Melbourne and Sydney's public transport. I've linked his channel in the description. It is definitely worth checking out if you haven't already. So his first question is, what's your favorite video that you've ever made? The pipe walk video where I walked from Yanyin Reservoir down to the reservoir in Reservoir. There we go. We got it eventually. That was lots of fun. I got to find a lot of historical artifacts along the way. I didn't know what a lot of them were at the time, but people did help me along later on, which was really good. And I got to be out and about and walk a long way in a day, which is something I really, really like doing. And another one of my favorites was a recent one, the Waverley Park video. I didn't really know anything about Waverley Park before I started making it, so I did get to learn a lot through the process of researching and going there. I didn't even really know what it was or that much of it was left. I'd heard of it vaguely before in passing, but I'm too young to have gone there when it was built. So it was a really mind-blowing experience of just how big it was and how big it was planned to be. And yeah, how much of it was left and how much of an impact it had on that area. So that would probably be my two favorite videos. I've got others, but I won't go into those. The second one is, what is a video that you've wanted to make for a long time but haven't made just yet? There are lots. Is the short answer. I've got a very long and growing list, mainly thanks to all of you for providing me with suggestions. And really, I would love to make all of these video topics one day. And hopefully I will get around to all of them. But one that I've had on my list for a very long time, almost since the beginning, but I haven't got around to doing yet, is a video on the history of Victoria's colonial military. So this was before Federation and after separation, when Victoria was its own colony. So a period of about 50 years or so. And at the time, for some of that time, each colony had its own military forces. So we had a Victorian army and a Victorian navy with, people with guns, and we had ships and all that other stuff that comes with having a military, and every colony had that as well to varying degrees. And it's a really interesting period of our history because imagine our states today having their own militaries. It sounds ridiculous today, but it was the case. And B, because it did have quite a significant impact on Melbourne today and Victoria today. We've still got a lot of relics and remnants of that period lying around, probably the most well-known being HMV Cerberus off the coast of Black Rock in Port Phillip. And yeah, it was just really interesting time. The fact that we even sent soldiers to wars, the most famous being the Boer War, where we had people from Victoria fighting in a Victorian military, not as Australian soldiers, but as Victorian soldiers. And it's not something that happened prior to that or since that, and probably won't happen again. So I would love to do a video on that, and I've kind of written some of it, but haven't finished it. So hopefully one day I can get around to doing that one. The next two questions come from OzEdge. And the first question is, what future major infrastructure projects do you feel Melbourne needs? Well, there's a long list. We've done a lot of infrastructure projects recently. We've had level crossing removals. We're doing Northeast Link, Westgate Tunnel, Metro Tunnel, a whole lot of stuff going on. So in terms of infrastructure, we've actually done a lot of that. In terms of what's needed, the PTV network development plan from, I think it was 2012, really honed in a lot of the rail infrastructure that's needed. Some of that's happened, which is terrific. And there's a lot in there that needs to happen over the next couple of decades or so. And obviously some of that has changed since then, because 2012 was, 12 years ago. So a lot has happened since then, but it's still very relevant, I think. And there's a lot in there that we could do to build up the rail network for the future. I think as well, we really need to look at moving freight and goods as well as passengers. It tends to get missed, the new and shiny things tend to be for passenger movements, particularly on public transport networks. And the movement of goods is just as important as moving people around. That's how our economy works. That's how we get deliveries and that sort of thing. So even small things like the Webb Dock line, we're going to have inland rail coming online at some point. And there's a lot of supporting infrastructure that needs to go with it. So looking at how not just the actual movement of goods, but what needs to go around it, warehousing, logistics, access, all those sorts of things. So I think they're probably the two areas of focus that I'd look at in terms of what infrastructure we need for the future. Second question is, which older plans that never made it off the drawing board do you wish we got to see carried through? It's a good question. There are a lot of proposed projects from the past, and I have made videos on some of them. And maybe, slight tangent here, but maybe I would like to do some videos on some of the more out there ideas, put it that way, for things that never got built. One that, comes up every 10 years or so is building a bridge over the heads for some reason between Queenscliff and Portsea. I remember seeing artist impressions of the most recent one, which was pretty hilarious. And there are lots and lots of other ones like that too. So I can get around to making some videos on those one day, hopefully. But in terms of what older plans I'd wish got carried through, you go back to the 1969 Melbourne Transportation Plan, as we've talked about, it wasn't just roads, although it was mostly roads. There were some things in there that could be useful today. Most notably, Rowville Rail, Doncaster Rail were two things in there, and obviously they had origins far before that. But yeah, they'd be handy today. And I think the interesting thing with Rowville Rail that gets missed a little bit is that the 1969 proposal and some of the earlier ones had it linking Ferntree Gully to, I think would have been Oakley or Clayton. So you would have had a heavy rail link between the Dandenong lines and the Belgrave line, so a cross-suburban connection. And it's kind of interesting to think about how, if that was built, how it would have altered the suburban development that was taking place at the time, and how different places like Knoxfield or Montana South or Mulgrave would look today if that had been built. And who knows, maybe Waverley Park might have survived if the rail line had been built. I don't know. But that would be interesting to see how that would have changed the pattern of Melbourne's development. The next two questions are from Tariq. Do you like Victoria's fare system? And what would be your ideal fare system for public transport? So to answer this, I guess we've got to look at overall what are the types of fare systems that we have. And you can have kind of three types, or a mix of the three. You can have time-based, trip-based, or distance-based. So time-based is based on how long you travel for on the network. So we've kind of got that with Mikey. You can pay for a 2-hour ticket or a daily ticket, and that's based on, you can travel as much as you like within that period of time, whatever it is. So for a 2-hour Mikey, you can travel to take as many trips as you can in that 2 hours, and you pay a flat fare for that. Trip-based is based on the number of trips you take. So a lot of places around the world have this where, you pay per vehicle or per section. So for example, if you catch a train and then you catch a bus, you pay individually for the train trip and then you pay for the bus trip. So just because you changed or just because it was within a period of time, it doesn't matter. You pay per number of trips you take. And the third one's based on distance you travel. So we kind of have that with Mikey where we've got different zones. I think it goes up to zone 20 in the regional areas. And in other places, you pay per kilometre or per section or something like that. So it's based on how far you go. Now, in terms of what the ideal fare system would be in Victoria, I think we've got a pretty good balance of it at the moment. I mean, the flat fare now for travelling across most of Victoria for $10.60 has been a really transformational change. We've seen a lot more people catching trains and buses and coaches to regional areas. So that's been a big help. And, that balance between time-based and distance-based, I think works reasonably well for Melbourne and Victoria. It's not perfect. I mean, there's always the issue where if you catch a tram 2 stops, it costs the same amount of money now as to travel from like Mildura to Malakuta. So there's a little bit in there that probably needs tweaking. There's the issue of short-term tickets, all that sort of thing. So, there's a few things in there that need to be fixed, but overall, it seems to work all right. And the second question is, any thoughts on night buses? So, night network is an interesting topic. It's not something I know too much about. I've only caught night network once, I think. But in terms of night buses specifically, they do fulfill an important function in the network. So not only for getting people to and from the CBD, but also acting as feeder services to trains. One thing that's interesting about night buses is you look at patronage data for it and it's very, very low. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that Night Network was launched at a time when rideshare started to become quite popular. So Uber, DD, all those companies. And particularly for the late night economy, that probably took quite a lot of patronage away from the night network that might otherwise be there. The second reason I think as well is that there's probably more fare evasion at that time than there would be at other times. So relying solely on raw Mikey touch-on data is not going to be very accurate. And I don't know how many surveys or whatever were done to estimate that patronage or what formulas used for Night Network specifically, because it's quite a different network to a daytime network. And a lot of those inputs into the formula would probably be quite different as well. So yeah, they seem to be useful, and I'd be wary of relying on the raw patronage figures as indicators of their success or not. So the next questions are from George TB9083. And this question is, would you want tram conductors back? So I think we've moved beyond having a need for a person to stand on every public transport vehicle, because I think there's plenty of technology around that can do the same thing now. It's 2024. I don't think we need tram conductors specifically. Having said that though, we definitely do need to have staff across the network, and that includes vehicles at stations, stops, etc. I've spoken about this before and I've written a bit on my blog about this too, that we can't rely entirely on digital or remote information provision. There's a lot of situations where having a physical person is a far better scenario for everyone involved. So I think personally we've seen a shift back slightly towards having more staff on the network over the past 5-6 years or so, after quite a long period of time when there was a big retreat away from having staff on the public transport network. So we saw, particularly after the privatisation of our public transport services, a big withdrawal of staff around. So not just tram conductors, but staff at stations and all that sort of thing. And I think at a certain point, the companies and the government realised that actually having staff on the ground is a really helpful thing to have. So we started to see, different iterations of that, like introduction of PSOs, slow and very slight reintroduction of staff at some stations. We've seen Yarra Trams put staff at some of the busy tram stops around the city and at major events. Those sorts of things that we've started, and even actually Kinetic in their latest bus franchise agreement, they've got a few bus customer service staff as well now at major interchanges and on some buses. So I think we've started to see more of that come back, which is terrific because we definitely need more of it. So to answer the question, I don't necessarily want tram conductors back, but having more staff across the network is definitely an improvement, and we do need more of that. The next question is from AJ's Transport AWPTV. Do you think urban planning YouTubers do enough to talk about urban planning in regional cities? Great question, and obviously I've talked about this quite recently, well, a related topic quite recently. Short answer is no. I think this is a big gap. And I think part of the reason why it's a big gap is because it's also a gap in the profession. And the reason for this, I suspect, is because most planners come from cities rather than rural or regional areas, at least in my experience. I don't actually have any data to back that up. That's pure anecdata. So we know, obviously, people grow up and people get educated in a particular environment. Most of those environments tend to be urban areas. So, rural and regional planning is its own discipline almost and needs to be treated as such. So what you might learn is relevant for planning in a city might not be relevant for regional and especially rural areas. There is still planning that needs to be done. It's just a different approach and different solutions in many ways. There's also a lot of overlap, obviously, but there definitely needs to be a recognition that it is a different, quite a different thing. So I think that translates to YouTube, where a lot of the literature and existing information around planning is specifically for cities. So I think, having more content on that would be terrific. Maybe, I'll put my hand up and say I haven't done much content on rural or regional areas. So maybe I'll go out and try and find some topics out in other parts of Victoria that we can look at. Next question is, are bike racks on buses useful? Yes, they are useful. They can be done very well. Canberra's had them for many years and they seem to work really well there. And lots of other cities around the world have them as well. They are helpful for not just for commuting, for people who want to ride to and from a bus stop. The bus might not go their whole journey and they want to hop off the bus and ride the last 2-3 kilometres. But it's also helpful for recreation because, we've got a lot of rail trails around the state and bike paths. A lot of them don't have rail connections. Some of them do, but a lot of them don't, or they only have a rail connection at one end. So having a coach or bus that has a bike rack is really, really helpful and can really expand the viable bike network for many people. Next one is, what is your favourite tram in Melbourne? Love this question, and I've been meaning to do a video on this for a while, so I'll leave the details for that video, but I've got two tied in first place because I can't pick between them. One of them might be a little surprising, but it's the C2 class tram, the Bumblebee tram that we have 4, I think, in Melbourne, or 5. Don't quote me on that. But I really, really like them. I've been on them a couple of times. The ride quality is very nice. I really like the aesthetics of the outside. And they're just a nice tram to be on. They're a really comfortable, modern tram. And the second top of my list is the B2 class trams. I just think they're a really classic Melbourne design. Again, they look nice from the outside, obviously very different to the Bumblebee trams, but they've got a solid kind of look and feel. It feels like, they're built like tanks. They're heavy, solid, on-road vehicles. And you can see when they were introduced, they were actually called LRVs, or light rail vehicles, to be introduced on the former Port Melbourne and St Kilda lines. And it was just, they're just from a period of time of, ComEng and building trams in Dandenong of that type and design. It's just, a bit of nostalgia. And I understand why they need to be phased out. Obviously, they're getting old, they're not accessible, that sort of thing. But they're definitely equal first with the C2 Bumblebee trams. I should say that the The C1 trams, the sisters of the C2s, are definitely nowhere near the top of the list and are very close to the bottom. But we might get to that in the future video, so watch this space. The next one, who's your favorite urban planning YouTuber? I watch quite a few of these channels. There aren't too many Australian ones that I know of, at least. Building Beautifully that I mentioned before is very good. Some non-Australian ones on this include CityNerd and NotJustBikes. They're really good, and I like learning about urban planning topics in other countries and what's going on elsewhere in the world, because there is a lot going on in the world. And there are a lot of other YouTube channels that I really like that aren't specifically related to urban planning. But Taitset's fantastic. WalkaboutWithRob, who's up in Brisbane, and he does some really interesting videos on the history of different places around Queensland mainly, and what's going on up there, and learned a lot from that. Another one, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It's a Welsh word, I think. Rheilffordd, with 2 F's and 2 D's. He hasn't got many videos, but they're really well produced and really engaging. So check that channel out. And a more recent one that I've found is Kane's Trains from South Australia. So I love a bit of South Australian Adelaide content. And that's a really good place to start. There are many others too. Can't name them all, but they're the kind of highlights. Next one is from JAL Flight 3513. What was your first urban/transport planning job out of uni? So my first transport planning job or urban planning job was as a transport planner at the city of Darebin. Now, a lot of transport planners don't come from planning. A lot do, but I think I've mentioned before there were a lot of different pathways into transport planning, and urban planning is one of them. So I studied urban planning and got my first job as a transport planner, which was great. Like that's what I wanted to do, and it ended up, being a career trajectory to where I am today, still doing transport planning, just at a different place. So yeah, it was a great job. I was at Darebin for a couple of years, got to do a lot of different things, and can recommend getting into transport planning if you are thinking about it. The next question is from Bretsky1234. What's something that Melbourne could learn from transport systems elsewhere in Australia? A couple of things off the top of my head. One would be wayfinding in general, from Sydney in particular. Sydney went through a process, I don't know how long ago, of really making a concerted effort to standardize all of their signage and communication to the point now where, you've got quite recognizable logos for different modes, for example. So you've got the yellow T for trains, you've got the blue or teal M for metro, you've got the green F for ferry, and so on. And it's pretty universal. There's, some gaps where, there's some old bus stops and that sort of thing. But by and large, it was a really concerted effort to make that happen. Here, we've got a complete patchwork of old and new signage stretching back 30, 40 plus years in some cases. But there's still the Met bus stops, in suburban Melbourne that are still in active use, all the way through to, the screens at Flinders Street Station platforms changing every year into a different format and not at any other station. We've still got railway stations less than 4 kilometres from the CBD that have no PIDs at all. So this... And the way that we tend to approach it, it seems, is an incremental approach where we just kind of sprinkle things everywhere every year and just gradually change things, which is fine for some things. But for something like wayfinding, if you're changing your branding, you need it to be consistent. Otherwise, it kind of defeats the purpose of changing your branding. So I'd say, learning from Sydney and other networks too of that really solid branding and wayfinding and communication. Finally, something to do with buses. Adelaide, I've loved the Go Zone branding, which is still there, I think. And it's been a long-standing signage and wayfinding kind of overarching theme. So you've got Go Zones where, I again, off the top of my head, I think it means that there's a bus every 15 minutes along that corridor. And if memory serves me correctly, there was Super Go Zones, which was every 10 minutes, I think. But basically, it would basically say if you wait at this stop, you're not going to be waiting for more than 15 minutes or whatever it was. And it was on all the bus stops on that particular stretch of road. So it didn't do it for a whole route because that particular route might be every half an hour or so, but it was good branding for a section of road where there was high frequency combined services of multiple routes. So it gives people some comfort and security that they can go to the bus and there'll be one there reasonably quickly rather than, a bus is not going to be there for 2 hours. So something like that for Melbourne, where especially for us, buses are kind of the poor third cousin of our public transport network for various historical reasons, and people don't think they're particularly reliable or frequent. And there is obviously some truth to that, but using brands like that to change people's perceptions around buses would be really great. And we've done it before. We saw how successful the Smart Bus brand was, which unfortunately we seem to have retired. But yeah, we've got examples right here in Melbourne of doing that. So yeah, learning from Adelaide and again other places too of using that theme and marketing to sell buses to Melburnians, many of whom don't really even consider buses as a viable transport option. The next question is from Katya Yanol. And this is, do you think Melbourne could ever host the Olympics again? Good question. It's a different question to whether Melbourne should ever host the Olympics again, which I won't comment on. But if we could host the Olympics, I definitely think we could. We've got all the sporting infrastructure that any city could ever want already here. So if we did hold the Olympics again, I don't think we need to build that many new stadiums or sporting facilities. We've got the MCG, a whole sports precinct, MSAC, everything else. We've already hosted the Olympics once with far less infrastructure, so I'm sure we could do it again with what we've got now. Our transport network as well is definitely used to those sorts of major events, which we've covered in previous videos. So I think we'd cope pretty well with that. And I guess the main thing with us is time zone differences. I don't know how many of you remember the games, the TV show based on the Sydney Olympic Games, and how they were talking about the issues about TV rights and how Sydney was in a different time zone and how that was going to mess up their contracts and stuff. So I suspect that might have something to do with it. But in terms of our on-ground infrastructure and our capacity to be able to host the Olympics, absolutely. I think we're probably one of the best equipped cities in the world with what we have now to be able to host a major event like that. The next couple of questions are from EasyD5757, who's from the US. So thanks for sending in your questions. Hello. What are your thoughts on the presence of less urbanism-related YouTube channels in Australia and New Zealand than there are in the US and Canada? And should there be more channels or stay the same but reach a wider audience? I've touched on this in my reaction video to the Urban Planning Problem YouTube video from the Nth Review about this geographic kind of void. Most urbanism channels are from the US and Canada, which is great. I mean, we learn a lot from those places, but there's definitely a lack of urban planning and transport YouTube channels from other parts of the world, and not just Australia, New Zealand, but Asia, Africa, even a lot of Europe as well. So in terms of whether there should be more channels or stay the same but reach a wider audience, if we need both, but if I had to lean towards one or the other, I'd say more channels. Because I've touched on this before, but locally made content is really important. And for something like planning and talking about cities, it's really valuable to have local context to understand why things are the way they are. It's very easy to kind of parachute in somewhere, particularly now with Google Earth or Google Maps, and have a look around and make some conclusions based on that. But there's always a backstory. There's always a reason why things are the way they are. And a lot of that may not be applicable to where you live, or it may be applicable to where you live. It's just you have to figure that out. And dropping a pin in Google Street View or something like that and then making a YouTube video based on that is not helpful in most situations, because you miss the context and you'll often draw wrong conclusions. And there are a lot of examples of that on YouTube, unfortunately, particularly now with, AI generated topics and, robot voices over, diagrams and that sort of thing. So having more YouTube channels by implication would mean more people, which is good because then there's a higher chance that that person will actually have some knowledge of the place they're talking about, which is the main thing, I think. The next one is, what are your thoughts on the very legitimate and valid concerns regarding the safety of women on transit? It's used by some in the US and Canada to oppose efforts to expand transit. Oh, I did not know that. That's very interesting. In terms of what my thoughts are, I mean, it's obviously a really important topic that needs to be addressed, not just in terms of actual safety, but perceived safety. This was something that's kind of come up, I don't know how recently, but in the past 10 years or so at least, both in the literature and in practice about, a place might be very safe according to the data, but it may not feel safe. So, and then that's enough to stop people from using it or make people feel unsafe in that area. So obviously making it safe is important to get people to use public transport and to build that brand of public transport, for want of a better word, as a perfectly valid and safe way to get around. So I'm no expert on the topic really, but things that make it feel and be safer are absolutely important and a vital part of the system. And there's no reason why you can use that as an argument to expand transit, in my opinion, because transit is not inherently dangerous, or public transport is not inherently dangerous. You can design very safe public transport, and you can also design very unsafe public transport, like you could with roads or cars or bikes or walking or anything else. So it's a matter of how you do it, not whether or not it exists. And the last question we have is from Jesse. What do you think made the 1969 transportation plan so influential on planning policy? And what would it take for a modern transportation plan to be similarly adopted across future generations of planners? Very interesting question. I think the 1969 plan was so influential not because it was like the greatest plan ever seen, but because it was the right plan in the right place at the right time. As we've spoken about, that was kind of the sweet spot of car-based urban planning, where that was seen as like the big thing and the future, and like we have to get on this bandwagon or we're going to get left behind. So it was absolutely perfect for politicians and bureaucrats who really wanted to expand car-based urban planning as far and as quickly as possible. And it was the blueprint for that, because nothing in there was really new. A lot of it came from the 1954 plan and the 1929 plan before that. So it wasn't like this amazing report of brand new ideas, although there were some new things in there, but it was mostly rehashed from before. It was just came at exactly the right time. The political environment was right. That mentality amongst decision makers was right. And car use and popularity was skyrocketing. So there was a real perception at the time that if we didn't do this plan, we'd be completely stuffed and be left behind the rest of the world. So that's why I think it became so influential. And from that, why it became influential in the future and why it's effectively still being implemented to this day is something called path dependence, where, to put it very, very simply, you keep doing the thing that you've previously been doing unless something drastic happens. So the 1969 plan really, and the 1954 plan before that, was the big switch from kind of non-car based to car based planning and actually starting to implement it. And we haven't really had a similar kind of switch away from that since. We've had some progress away from it, and that's been incremental, but we haven't had like a big sudden switch like the 1969 plan or oil crisis or something like that. So in terms of what it would take for a modern plan to be adopted today, it just has to be the same thing, really, the right thing at the right place at the right time. There's not much else to it, it seems. So yeah, just copy the same blueprint of the 1969 plan and how that came about, and we'll give that a shot and see if that works. So that's it for the questions. As I said last time, I never really planned for things to get this far when I started doing it about 4 years ago. I thought I'd be lucky to get 1,000 subscribers or something, but it's amazing to see so much interest in local history about Melbourne and Victoria. It's really, really good. And it motivates me to keep going and keep making videos. So yeah, in the future, see how we go. I'll keep making these videos and, you know, maybe try some new things. But yeah, thanks so much for your support again. And thanks for watching if you've made it to the end. And I'll see you in the next video.